starting again in verse 21. I'm going to be reading down into verse 34. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garment, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Father, as we go into the scriptures this morning, I pray that we would just have our hearts ready and our minds open to learn what it is we need to learn from this beautiful passage. As we continue on walking through these encounters and these healings that Jesus had in the life of his ministry, I pray that we would take away what it is we need to. I pray that we would see the things that we need to. Amen. As original as I am, I've titled this message this week, as always, because I spend a lot of time on trying to figure out how to name these things. I just said the woman healed. It's an easy one. Take it right out of the little heading here in my Bible, and I want us to take a look at how God works and moves in our lives as we continue on in this encounter series and as we take a look at the healings that Jesus performed during his ministry. But one of the things I want us to really focus on as we understand this passage, and in combination with the one next week as we take a look at the man by the pool, that how we are healed and how God moves in our life is never determined by how much faith we have, nor is it determined by how little faith we have. God moves according to his own goodness and his own time and in his own way under his own providential care. And he works so that his works and his name would be made known, not so that we can prove that our faith is enough or that we have to do something more in order to get his attention. It is never about that. So that is one of the things that I want us to see here in this story and next week as well, to try and just kind of bring balance to the fact that there are a good many people, well-intended, who think that the reason why they aren't healed or the reason why God isn't answering their prayers because perhaps their faith isn't strong enough. I want to work through those things over the next couple weeks because I'm always fascinated to see in the Gospels just how it is Jesus moves. The one who of all people should have been in a hurry because he had so many assignments to do never seemed to be in a hurry. Drove everybody crazy around him. There was always time for one more conversation along the way. There was always time for one more stop along the road. And there was always time for one more moment to pray, one more lesson to be had, one more sermon to be preached, no matter how pressing it was. We can think of John in John chapter 11 and Lazarus as a good example. But he understood, and I think that we need to understand that people are not projects. People are not boxes that we check off on a given day. That they were never a frustration to Jesus, with the exception of the Pharisees, of course. And that was only because they should have known better, not because they just irritated him for no reason. But people were then, and they continue to be today, Jesus' primary concern in this world. Not about how we feel, not about what we think, not about where we come from, but the very fact that we bear his image, we are his prime concern in this world. The restoring and the building of faith and relationship back with God the Father. That means that we too, if we are genuine followers of Jesus, ought to be thinking along the same lines. If we are to be about our Father's business, as Jesus talks about in these stories, we ought to be thinking along those lines of, should I stop for a moment even though I have a million things to do today? Does this person need 5 minutes of my time even though I have 14 hours worth of work in an 8-hour day? See, as we move forward here as a church, I'd like us to remember that the Rock's mission here is to help the lost be found and to make lifelong followers of Jesus. help the lost to be found, and make lifelong followers of Jesus. I want that to be our mission. It has always been the DNA and the mission of this church, but I want us to be reminded of that all the time. Everything we do and everything we desire to do as a church here ought to be filtered through that and circled back to that. Why? Because if that was Jesus' mission in this world, and if we have been sent into this world as his disciples and his followers, we are to make disciples, we are to baptize, and we are to teach. How's the easiest way to say that? Because everything we have to do needs to drive through that. It's real simple. We don't forget that as a church, that we are to help the lost to be found, and we are to make lifelong followers of Jesus. If we overcomplicate it, mission gets lost, and we end up tackling issues that make no difference in this world. We find this morning that while others around Jesus begin to lose their mind on this journey, Jesus stays very calm. He calmly moves along, or in this case, he simply stops when the whole crowd wants him to rush along to this man's daughter. And I can only imagine the thoughts that are running through Jairus' head as he's the dad who has asked Jesus, and I've preached on this before years ago, but it just still amazes me because I know what I would have been doing. How he was feeling behind Jesus as he's trying to shove this guy along. My daughter's dying, and you want to pull up stops and ask stupid questions. That's how I would think. I don't know how you would think, but that's how I would think. He just simply stops. In full panic, Jairus must have wanted to scream at him, "What are you doing? We still got 2 miles to go. My daughter is on her deathbed. Why are you stopped here? Get a move on, mister. We don't have all day." Again, that's how I would think. I know most dads would as well. I mean, if we're honest, we are all more like that man at some point in our life, and there's nothing wrong with that because there are times when we ought to be a little bit pushy until, of course, there is something wrong with that because God's really wanting to do something bigger than we think, or something bigger than we want because we don't understand what's going on. And he operates on his terms and within his time frames to help things make sense because we don't know everything that he knows. So I would submit to you this morning as we take a look at this that there was no rush at all for Jesus. None. Absolutely none at all. Why do I say that? Because he sees and knows things which we don't. And if we take a look at the very first verse, 24a, he said, "And he went with him." 5 words. And he went with him. Tells me that the length of that journey didn't matter to Jesus because the moment he decided to go with this man, that girl was going to live regardless of how he found her when he got to Jairus' house because he made the decision to go with him. But you see, the process, this is where we come in. The process and the panic and the growth and the faith all built along the way, all led people to see God at work in his world, in the framework that he wanted them to see. And as a result, people believed. Again, it's about people and not a process, even though processes are important. And this is important for us to see. Not that we get what we want, but that God and his works be seen and be known among his people. And for those who have never heard of Jesus or encountered Jesus, these are the moments that they sit back and go, "What's going on here? This is a little bit different." Because it's always at this point in all of the encounters that people start to take a look at what's going on. It's the restoration of broke and sick people. That's why Jesus came. It's the restoration of sinful people trying to find their way in the world. You see, that God's glory be seen and made known in this world is the primary function of the church, and that our faith in him as our sovereign constantly be increased. Because when I look at this whole story, it seems to me that what was supposed to have been the main thing that Mark talked about here actually was nothing more than a catalyst for an encounter with a woman who had been dealing with an issue for as long as this little girl who was on her deathbed had actually been alive. We take a look here, the beginning of the story and the end of the story in Mark 5:25, there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. At the end of the story, Mark 5:42, immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. I don't think it's an accident that that's recorded. For as long as this little girl had been alive, at the end of her life, this woman had been dealing with this issue. I have to admit, and my wife will attest to this because I would be a liar if I said otherwise, I am a very impatient person when it comes to getting to a destination. I'm better than I used to be, but not quite where I ought to be. We took 4 hours to get down to Mount Ascutney on a beautiful ride down 100. We took a little excursion, was it 103? I think it was. Took a wrong turn and discovered about 15 minutes into that wrong turn that it was a pretty ride, but we needed to go back. Otherwise, we were going to end up in the wrong spot. But you see, far too often in my life, at 54 years old now, I have missed the drive. I have missed the views. I have missed the conversations that I could have with my wife and my kids in the car because I was just too busy to get to where I was, or even worse, some fool and idiot decided to get in front of me and do the speed limit. 40 miles an hour on Route 100, while it's safe, sir, it's not always what I want to do, but it is what I ought to do. Now, I share that not necessarily as an illustration, although it is. I just want to confess to people that I have a hard time with knowing that I have to be at point B. I want to get there as quick as possible. Many of you, like me, like to race that time that says you will arrive at this time. That to me was a challenge. My wife said, no, that's an estimation on when you're going to get there. It will change no matter how fast you try. And so I discover in this, not just being a dad, but an impatient person, I understand what Jairus' issue is. I understand why he's pushing so hard and why he's probably stressed out. A great deal of our problem as human beings, at least in my experience, is that we are far too great a hurry to accomplish a lifetime worth of stuff on a particular Wednesday afternoon. We are in such a mindset that we have to complete everything yesterday, and if we don't get it done, we're somehow a failure. How often we miss a lot of fun on the way. We don't realize how much we have to learn, because the journey is actually as much a part of what we're doing as the destination. And when we do learn all the things we do, and we get to where we're going, we discover that somewhere along the way, we've had an encounter with the Lord. He has moved in different ways that we probably wouldn't have seen if we weren't going so slow. You see, this woman is nameless, and I don't like that. She's just a woman with an issue of blood. So I picked out a name that I really like, and that's Sarah. That's what we're going to call her today because I want to be a little bit more personal. She's got a lot to teach us. You see, in an impatient and short-memoried world, we see in her a long-term faithfulness in one direction. She had an issue, and she wanted it fixed. It's a faithfulness that drove her to do something about her situation, no matter how difficult it was. So we discover he went with him, Jesus with Jairus, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. I often wonder why Luke would have recorded something like that, but he makes note of that too. As a doctor, he must have been a little unsettled. But you see, faith is a funny thing. Faith is a very funny thing. We exercise faith in our lives because we believe in something, or we believe in someone that is bigger than us, that helps us understand this grand scheme and narrative of things. And yet we also at the same time have faith and ought to have faith in our abilities to do the things that we have been gifted to do, that we have been called to do in this world. We can't just sit like lumps on a couch and hoping everything gets done. God works in both ways. In fact, he works best in conjunction with us operating in our faith and in the gifts that we have. We have to learn to balance those two truths in our life. That while we have to have faith that God will operate on our behalf, we also have to be active participants in it. That's why it's actually easier to understand James than we give it credit for, because he defines faith and works together. I will show you my faith by what I do. To me, that's not a complicated passage. Saying you have faith and then hoping that God's going to give you a garden and nothing happens when you've done nothing, that's foolish. That's not faith. God is working in and through our lives and is never determined by how much faith we have or we don't have, though. He will work according to his plan. And we're going to look at that fella next week at the pool of Siloam, and we're going to discover that there was a miracle that happened there in spite of faith. Here we have a miracle that happened because of faith. So faith, as the Bible defines it, because we need to understand this, is real simple in Hebrews 11. Faith is what? It's the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things unseen. And that entire chapter of Hebrews talks about a whole bunch of people. They call it the Hall of Heroes, or the heroes of the faith. They believed in the promises that God had made to them, even if in their lifetime they never saw them fulfilled. We get a few verses from that particular chapter that I want to read through to help us understand that. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Can you live your entire life praying the same exact prayer and feeling like you've never got an answer for it and still have the faith in the one who you're praying to? That's what happened here. That's what happened here. Talking about Moses in verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Can we understand in our trying times, like Moses, that because God promised we would be okay, we don't know what it looks like on the other side, but we're going to step into what he's telling us to, regardless of whether we know what it looks like on the other side, because he's made that promise. We don't have to be afraid. That's faith. All these things, though commended through their faith, verses 39 and 40, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. Now he's grouping us in that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. There will be a day when every single faith moment, even if it has not been fulfilled, will come to pass. When we are all together on that day. Don't ask me when, don't ask me how. I'm not that smart. None of us are. But we just believe that by faith. So like this woman, Sarah, as we take a look at her this morning, all of these people were moved to do something because of their belief. Jairus didn't go to find Jesus because he was hoping something would happen. Now, Parks and I were talking this week when we were out for a coffee, and I was struck by something he said, and I asked him to find me the quote when he preached on this, and it makes good sense to me, so I just had to use it. He had said, everyone in the Bible that was sick that Jesus touched got healed. It's just the way it is. But she touched Jesus and she got made whole. Now, if you hear nothing else for the rest of me preaching, this is good. She touched Jesus and she got made whole. When he has to come to you, you will get your miracle. But when you pursue him, he will fix it all. See, that's a faith promise. She was healed, she was saved. That's the encounter. I take time to look at all these things and talk about these things because it's important that we see biblical faith for what it genuinely is and not our fickle faith in this world. We don't want to live in that changes every time I have a bad feeling about something. Faith itself, first and foremost, is a matter of both the heart and mind, not just how I feel. You see, she pursued him. She had a feeling in her heart because she knew what he had been doing. That is an evidence-based faith. It's unmeasurable. It's an assurance, as the writer to the Hebrews tells us. It's an assurance of things hoped for. That's the heart. I hope for certain things. But I believe that God will bring them to pass because he has proven himself over and over again. We come to the Lord's table at the end of service today, and what are we doing there? We do that by faith, believing that he rose. We are remembering what he did in the past today here in Little St. Albans, Vermont, because we are assured of what he will do in the future. That is the whole purpose to coming to the table. We celebrate the Lord's death until he comes. That's the promise that he gives us. We do it in remembrance of him. It's also the evidence of, or the conviction of, as the King James likes to say, of things not seen. So this is a rational and reasoned faith. In a world that likes to look at the church and say Christians are just a bunch of pipe dreamers. They just believe stuff that you can't prove. That, you're always floating around 2 feet above the ground, not grounded in anything. No, you see, faith is a rational and reasoned faith. It has to be rooted in something believable. I don't just believe the Bible because it makes me feel good. In fact, more often than not, it makes me feel like garbage because I know the blackness of my heart at times in my life. And that's a challenge to know who God is. And it's reasoned out. It's not a bunch of fairy tales. You can actually try to disprove it if you would like. And more often than not, much like C.S. Lewis, you find yourself kicking against the goads. And you discover that it is a very true thing, and it's very hard to disprove. And the example that I always use, again, because, it's just a simple thing. You can confess to high heaven that you can fly. But if you ain't in a plane and you're 14,000 feet in the air without a parachute, flap all you want. Terminal velocity happens at some point, and that stop's going to hurt. All the way to the ground, you can confess you're going to fly. That is faith in something foolish. That's not the faith that this woman has. Faith in someone that not only do you believe in your heart, but that you have reason to believe in your head. It works itself out and it proves itself because God is faithful. And we see that here. Sarah here didn't do what she did because it was the next thing to try on her list, as if this was some sort of traveling show, because it just made sense, although it does make sense. She had heard the reports of what Jesus had been doing. She had seen people coming back to her, and she had enough faith in her heart without seeing it in those reports as being true that she was going to put herself in a position to where she could reach out and she could act upon the belief that she had in who this Jesus was. She just happened to do it at a time and at a place that disrupted a poor dad's day, and it unsettled him. Faith plus works. You see, she had heard the reports about Jesus, verses 27 and 28, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. If I touch even his garment. Now, as an aside, we need to remember that this doesn't then mean that if this happens once to us, we can start our own little traveling ministry show. Like the guy with the mud that was rubbed on his eyes. That'd be kind of gross. I'm not so sure you'd have too many people in line waiting for that. But this doesn't mean that we set up that show as if we now all of a sudden have a traveling healing ministry. Because it's not about me, and it's not about you. It's about what God does in and through his people. Because God changes his motive or the way in which he does things pretty much in every miracle and every healing. And I think that that's intentional. So we can't start up our own little show. Does God heal today? Absolutely, but he does it the way he wants. I'm not going to start a ministry that tells people to send me $50 and I'll send you a hanky. I'm not trying to be funny, but we need to be biblical. We need to understand that God, in his sovereignty, makes these decisions. It is not our job to somehow capture that lightning in a bottle and make a healing ministry out of it. So many people have been hurt so deeply because they believe these things. And then they think that their faith is not strong enough. And then they question who God is. That's not how God operates. I know that because the scriptures show us that. And we're going to learn this next week that our faith is not necessary at all if God decides to do something. Some miracles, such as this one, come about because of faith. Others do not. God still acts, and that brings about a believing faith. That's the important thing in these stories. So let's be careful always to be grounded in God's word as it relates to how it is we operate in faith. Let's not operate in our feelings. Feelings are dangerous. Too often people believe that unbiblical teaching that you have not been healed. You have not been blessed, and you have not been given the things or whatever it is you've asked simply because they lack that faith. It's very unsound and unbiblical. Say it one last time. It is always up to God. It's not up to us. He's faithful to operate through our acting upon our faith, and sometimes, amazingly enough, he acts in spite of it, but it is always him that acts. So in the middle of this huge crowd, in the middle of this melee going up the road to Jairus' house, probably with his wife waiting at home, wanting to know what's taking so long, to see if Jesus can heal this sick girl, Sarah takes the risk, unclean as she is, because any of you who know your Bibles understand that if she's got an issue with blood, she shouldn't be near people. So she's taking a whole bunch of risks here. She reaches out and she touches the corner of his garment. She doesn't even need to ask for a favor. She just understands that this is what he's going to do. And God chose to act on her behalf because of her faith. Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garment?" Now, speak, Lord, for your servant's listening. But the unexpected happens. Now let's think about this. Any irrational man who's trying to get from point A to point B, if you've ever left a sporting event or anything like that, or a concert, if I turn around and look at my wife with 100,000 people leaving Loudon Racetrack and look at her and go, "Who touched me?" So the disciples respond just the way we would. You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?" Again, Mark cleans that up a little bit. I think they're like, "Are you nuts? Do you see how many people are pushing against you? Do you understand what's going on here? I probably am the one that touched you. I'm right behind you, and I just got shoved. I don't know. Are you serious? Who touched me?" But there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that question, because in the midst of the entire crowd, somebody needs to be identified because something just happened powerful enough to Jesus to recognize that power went out from him. And it needs to be identified, and it needs to be brought to everyone's attention. Why? Not to embarrass the person, not to make fun of, not to make light of, but rather to validate the faith of the person that said, "All I got to do is touch his garment." Just to validate that, to affirm her in her belief that what she actually believed came to pass, that her feeling that she has now that this issue has been taken care of isn't a figment of her imagination. She had taken a risk, and he wanted to validate that. She broke the law, and yet here she was, and she had hoped to be anonymous. So just touch his cloak, I'll go home. Be in, be out, Bob's your uncle, everything's good. It's not how it's going to work. There she was. But that didn't work. Jesus wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't let it pass without some sort of acknowledgement. You see, when God does something in someone's life, in your life, it has to be declared. We don't sit on it. "Oh, he healed me. Well, that's nifty. I'm going to go home and not tell anybody." See, that was the problem with Jesus, is nobody could keep their mouth shut. Today, in this day and age, we can't open our mouths. Jesus doesn't want to embarrass her. What Jesus wants is he wants to restore her. He wants to reconcile her. He wants to make sure she understands that the Lord has healed her after 12 long years of suffering, being separate, being unclean, and being an outcast in this world. A daughter of the King has been healed. A daughter of the King has been healed and has been made right. And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. I don't want to belabor this and get too long into this, but a public profession is always what we look for as a result of what God has done privately. We are all called to do this, as uncomfortable sometimes as it makes us. And how could we and why would we keep these things quiet? Why would we? You see, baptism, which is going to happen in a couple weeks, is one of those things where people who come to faith in Christ make a public profession by being baptized. And some people like to share their story, how it is God brought them to that place. Not everybody, but some people do, so we afford them that opportunity. Because you see, when Jesus captures our hearts, when he captures our hearts and he heals us, he heals our homes, he restores our broken marriages, he restores our relationships, he brings our kids back to us and back to faith, he fixes the relationships in our families, and he provides for us a way that we cannot explain. Why in heaven's name wouldn't we want to share that? Why wouldn't we? And thank him for it. See, she had acted on her faith. And in that particular instance, that acting, that taking that risk to step out of her comfort zone is what brought the blessing to her. God honored her faith. In verse 34, to me, we were praying as elders this morning. This is what strikes me. It's so beautiful and so important. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. He didn't say woman. He didn't say lady. He didn't use her name. He looked at her and he said, daughter. That is such a personal calling to somebody and an acknowledgement to somebody. Daughter. You're a daughter of the King of the universe. And you have been healed. And you have been restored. Your disease is gone. See, God in heaven has worked through Jesus, his son, in order to restore one of his children. And God wants to acknowledge what his daughter's obedience to trust that he would take care of this, to believe and brought about. He doesn't want her to slip away. Daughter. You see, she believed, just like the heroes of old, that God would do what he promised. That's what she believed. So why does this matter to us? Well, you see, the thing is that God always hears and he answers the prayers of his believing people. He just doesn't do it in the way that we like or expect. But he always answers the prayers of his children. I want you to hear that. He always answers. Why he heals sometimes on this side of eternity, I don't know. And why it is he takes people home to be with him, and that is the healing, I do not know. It's not for me to know. But I do know that he hears the prayers of his people. One of the lessons that we need to learn, however, is this, that God will always give us what we need because he knows what we do not. If we knew everything that God knows, and this is Tim Keller, if we knew everything that God knows, we would pray far differently than we do. And it is one of the prime reasons why Jesus taught us to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's why we start there, because he knows things we don't. It is never about what we think is best. It is always about what God knows is best. Sometimes that's hard, but I can promise you that in eternity, this will all make sense. It will all make sense, even if sometimes right now it doesn't. But we have to trust in God's sovereignty and his providential care. An illustration to help seal this up, and then the worship team, and we all can sing one more song. N.T. Wright puts it this way. It's kind of like the drawing that you get from your grandchild. You give them the crayons and the white paper at the table, and they draw this picture, and in their mind, they know exactly what it is. And you look at it and go, nice. Just a bunch of lines, right? Even in glory, N.T. Wright says those drawings will make sense when everything comes together. So even if we don't understand why he answers prayer the way he does, the promise is that there is a special thing waiting for all of us when we get there, and it'll all make sense.